E nā mana, e nā reo, e nā iwi, e ro rangatira mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, kia ora to you all. Okay, so this morning I'm going to start off with some positive news, some great news. So last night NZGBC launched the very latest version of Green Star Buildings. It's a project that we've been working on for the past nearly 2 years, consulting with the sector. We had a great launch party. Thanks for everyone that turned up. And thanks also for the whole of my Green Star team that have worked so hard over the past year to bring that tool in. Just to say that Green Star over the next 3, 4, 5 years is going to put, amongst other things, but is going to put the reduction of carbon emissions in our built environment absolutely front and center. The other great piece of news is that in the last couple of months, we reached a fantastic milestone with Green Star. We reached 300 certified buildings over the 15 years that we've been, certified projects, I should say, over the 15 years that we've been in operation. That's a great milestone to reach. We want to do so much more. So, with the new version of Green Star buildings, please come and start registering. The other piece of news is that, having just launched last night Green Star buildings, which is our toughest and most sustainable Green Star yet, we're already starting to get a number of clients who are saying, we want to do that. That's where we want to head. That's going to be my last positive slide. So this morning, my presentation is going to be pretty negative, I have to say. So I thought I'm going to base a lot of my presentation actually on a fantastic report, which is pretty long, but is the first monitoring report that the Climate Commission put out, I think last month, which really tracks our progress in terms of reducing emissions in Aotearoa. And what's interesting and what's great news is that we've started bending the curve, so New Zealand's emissions are starting to plateau and are starting to come down. They've reduced, I think, every year for the past 2, maybe 3 years, which is great to see. What's also great to see in the monitoring report is that they separate out buildings and they actually report on how we are doing as a sector. And the answer is, while lots of other sectors are reducing their emissions, ours are continuing to climb. So this great graph here, this is just showing on-site emissions, so the gas and coal burnt within our buildings. As you can see, the light blue at the top there is commercial buildings, the dark blue is residential buildings. Both are still rising and continue to rise despite all the efforts that we're putting in. This chart on the right here is the overall energy consumption in our buildings. That is also rising, and we need it to be reducing, and we need the policies and the measures and the real effort from the sector to bend this curve, unlike the curve that is being bent elsewhere. We got off to a bit of a good start with the first emissions reductions plan that came out under the previous government, where we actually, we lobbied very, very hard after they produced their draft report to have a dedicated chapter for buildings and construction, which they did. And that chapter put in, some good words, some good hui, as the previous slide put in. We didn't get much dewey, but we got the hui, which is, they were proposing to have embodied carbon brought into the building code. They were going to propose grants for environmental product declarations, so that's, the products and material suppliers working out their carbon emissions. They were going to require waste minimisation plans at building consent. Operational carbon was going to be required, so you're going to be required to report on your operational carbon at building consent. Mandatory EPCs, so this idea that we would, for existing buildings at point of a lease or sale, you would have to declare the energy use of that building, and they were going to widen warmer Kiwi homes and increase the amount of insulation and other energy efficiency measures that we were rolling out in Aotearoa. Come on to the second emissions reduction plan. Instead of a whole chapter on building emissions, we get one paragraph. And it's this one. The government intends to support green building practices in New Zealand and work to establish a clearer picture of this is underway. Pretty underwhelming, huh? And if we move back to the monitoring report, and bearing in mind this monitoring report was really based on the kind of actions of the previous government, they're saying that there's some very interesting conclusions in that report. They say things like, the existing regulatory system does not sufficiently support or require emissions reductions in new or existing buildings. No shit. They criticised the delayed action for the Buildings for Climate Change team at MB. So that team has been running since 2019. So they've been running for 5 years. They've achieved basically nothing, really, haven't they? We'd all acknowledge that. The Building for Climate Change team, okay, they've produced some reports basically on what we're going to do about new buildings, but we all know that existing buildings are also, the majority of our emissions. There's been no word at all from MB on exactly what we're doing in terms of reducing emissions from existing buildings. And this is a really missed opportunity, right? So in May this year, NZGBC published this Closing the Gap report. And as Andrew mentioned, there's probably around 6 million tonnes of emission savings that our sector can introduce up till 2030. Things like a phased improvement in the building code for new buildings, things like bringing in energy performance certificates, so making building owners report on the carbon emissions from their buildings. And the other one is that slow electrification of heating, so phasing out gas. We're already seeing very high gas prices as a result of the crunch in terms of gas supply in New Zealand. Instead of increasing gas supply, we should be making our buildings more efficient and getting our buildings off gas. Okay. And that 6 million tonnes, it may not seem a lot, but it's around 11% of the savings that that the Climate Commission says that we should be introducing by 2030. So, our sector can contribute quite a lot of that. Okay, and not only do we miss out on the emission savings, but we also miss out on the opportunity to, I know this is a commercial building summit, but it's important to acknowledge that when we're making residential buildings, we're also making our whānau warmer, we're making our businesses more efficient, we're making our businesses less or more resilient to things like the crunch in the gas supply and so on. And we're reducing that peak demand on the grid that's the topic of conversation at the moment around our electricity supply. Really important that we get on with that. So the message really to you is that we can do this. And we know that because we've got the measured results from things like, admittedly, this is Australia. So in Australia, they've had compulsory reporting of energy and emissions from commercial buildings for the past 15 years. And they've got reams and reams of data now that shows that it works. So what this chart shows is that on average, each building, as it measures its emissions and reports and mandatorily reports its emissions every year, it makes these emission savings so that by the 13th rating, over 13 years, on average, the building has reduced its emissions by 38%. Big savings are possible. We're currently working on the impact report for Green Star, so that will be published in the next few months. There's some great data that's coming out of that. So this is some research that we've done around looking at, actually, because we've got neighbours in New Zealand, which is obviously voluntary here, but we can actually look at the average emissions and energy use of buildings built in the last 15 years, ones that are either Green Star or not Green Star. And you can see here that on average, the Green Star buildings are the energy use on the right, the non-Green Star on the left. And you can see on average, we've got something like a third reduction in energy use from Green Star rated buildings. So we know Green Star works, and it's only going to get tougher in terms of asking buildings to reduce their emissions. And meanwhile, we said this was going to be a stock take. The rest of the world is streets ahead of us. So, the European Union has had the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive since 2006. So they've had mandatory energy labels for nearly 20 years. We're now starting to see many member states and other parts of the world making the reporting of embodied emissions, so emissions associated with the construction materials, also mandatory as part of the building code. It's not just the EU, New South Wales has also brought that in too. So, we're way behind in terms of regulating this stuff. Okay, so really my message for you is, or the key ask that I'm asking for as part of this presentation is 3 things that I really want us to be doing in Aotearoa. We need to have transparency at the building consent stage, so we need to know, have a nationally consistent methodology for measuring and reporting on operational carbon and embodied carbon from the new buildings that we build, and we also need to bring in mandatory reporting for existing buildings. And really what I want to say is, at the moment, without this, we're really fighting in the dark. I'll bring the bit of a gimmick. But as we all know, if you can't see where you're going, if you don't, you can't control what you don't measure. And at the moment, we don't have that nationally consistent methodology for measuring and reporting on the energy and emissions from our buildings, and that's desperately what we need to introduce over the next few years. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes.
Tēnā koe, Sam. I don't know how I feel about that. Kōrero afterwards, bro? It certainly feels like a massive awakening. You've got a room here full of, property developers, designers, policymakers, product companies. What is the one thing that they can do, the one thing that will make the biggest difference in light of what's happening?
Well, that's a really good question. I guess the best thing you could be doing is, although I've said we don't have an officially mandated government methodology for measuring our embodied emissions and operational emissions for existing buildings, we do have those tools. So NZGBC has those tools. I just really recommend that everyone gets on it. If you're building a new building, if you own a new building, get on with reporting on those emissions and get transparent and let the market know what's going on. Beautiful. It's only when we bring it out in the open that we can reduce it.
Yeah, bro. We can't make progress if we can't see what we're tracking.
That's it.
So whānau, jump on the Green Star tool. Is that right?
That's it.
Launched yesterday.
Yep.
And register your projects and use it to your advantage. So tēnā koe hoa. Thank you so much for your kōrero.